It's an honor to be here at Georgia Tech to speak with you about the work that Duvall Decker does. I'm not speaking directly to the expanded practice. I kind of went through a round of doing that when we really came up with it. But Scott, since you brought it up, I do just want to say a little bit about it. That facilities maintenance arm really came from clients asking us to help them understand how to care for their building. We were trying to make buildings that were easily maintained, but with the mechanical systems we have today, our clients in rural Mississippi needed help taking care of their buildings. So that just sort of grew out of being there for the clients, being asked to help interview janitors or whatever else. The good consequence, the question about making money, and I was telling Joel this earlier, is particularly if you do public work, the cash flow of an architecture firm is like this. If you have a contract to take care of a building, the cash flow is like this. So it's not that we necessarily are making a lot more money, but in those times when we might have to lay somebody off, we don't have to do that. So those times have helped us keep architectural staff employed. And that's a really good thing. And the other side of that is there's so much learning that takes place when you take care of a building and see the consequences of the decisions that you make as a designer. You see them living for years after you've made them. So it's a really good learning. And they are separate companies, but everybody works for Duvall Decker. So everybody's working out of the Duvall Decker company. So my partner, who is also my partner, Roy Decker, and I founded the firm really to do public work. And at that time, we shared a belief, it was really a faith, that good design was a human right, not a luxury. And we set to figure out what that meant in a practice in Jackson, Mississippi. And I say faith because that was a place neither one of us were from, in a place where we had no family. We certainly had no family money to back up the firm and keep us supported. And we had no political influence as well. So it really was a leap of faith to think that we would be able to make a difference in the public realm. Roy and I just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary, so I can say that we're really well matched. I can confidently say that now. Each of our strengths is really balanced by the other's weaknesses. And we continue to have this conversation about how and why we want to do this work that really challenges us and keeps us going every day. So Roy is a teacher, a long-term teacher. I call him my forever teacher, really. He's a critical thinker and a painter. This is one of his paintings on the right. He has this remarkable ability to suspend his judgment about a problem so that he doesn't rush to conclusions. And I really count on that perspective every day. I am always seeking to create those indescribable moments that I first felt through music, later in poetry, and finally in architecture. And we didn't get, I had actually this piece we were set up to play it. So that would have been the first time I shared that with a crowd. So I actually feel relieved. So, I'm constantly really trying to figure out those. I described it, I can't remember who I was talking to about Faye Jones, that first moment when your heart skipped a beat over architecture, that happened later. And I just started trying to figure out, how are they doing that to me? How do they move me in that way? And how do they make that potential for effective space? We founded the firm in 1998, so this is our 20th year. December 7th, you're invited to an open house in Jackson. We'll be throwing a big party. And it started with just the two of us in the attic of the house, but so many people, and these are all of them here, including maintenance supervisors and custodians who have contributed and continue to contribute to the work. And at the time we founded the firm, I'm from West Tennessee, Roy's from New Jersey. I had no idea how quickly we would become sort of true Mississippians, but it happened. When you found a firm in a place, it roots you quickly to that place and its people. So the people at Duvall Decker, our clients, the people who use our buildings, they're really our privilege to know and to serve every day. And the people we work with, our clients, our staff, the thing that we share is that we don't believe that the work is what we're doing is about us. And it's not simply about form making. It's about the consequences of our work in the lives of others. Our firm and a lot of our practice is in Jackson, Mississippi, and that's a place who we feel like its challenges are also its greatest inspirations. Jackson, like so many other cities, has suffered white flight, and planning that attempted to chase that population and spread the city out and chase the population as it goes. Jackson was at its highest density, the red portion of the map on the left, in 1918. Yet this is our current land use plan on the right. I do believe it is now under construction, hopefully. Even though we have areas of the inner city that are at rural density levels. But they're still following that unsustainable plan, keep on expanding infrastructure that you can't afford to maintain. So in 2010, just 3 to 4 days of freezing temperature, and the little stars on the map are all of the water breaks. We essentially became a city without drinking water from just some freezing temperatures. So Jackson's inner city communities, despite all of these problems and issues, have a lot of committed residents and rich histories, and we do community planning work within Jackson and other communities in the state. But in general, they suffer persistent poverty, crime, and stagnant economies. So when we work in those areas, it requires a special kind of design and planning effort. We also practice throughout Mississippi, a state whose economic and cultural history is a story of struggle and inequity that really continues today. You can't talk about Mississippi without talking about the history of cotton and all of the things that flow from that. The work of the civil rights movement is alive in Jackson and in Mississippi, and it's inspiring. A lot of these people are still there. This is the Tougaloo Nine, who were arrested multiple times for doing read-ins at public libraries. And these living heroes in 2017 came to unveil the Freedom Trail marker that was in front of the library to honor them. But the civil rights movement is also remarkably present and undone. As I drive by the Jackson Municipal Library, that's the backdrop of this photo, and it's empty and unused, like so many buildings in downtown Jackson. We work in the Delta and have for many years in places that have 4 to 5 times America's average poverty rate. The palpable need, little money for building, little money for maintenance. We've done building projects, multiple building projects, some of which I'll show you in the Delta. And we're now working on a small town planning partnership with Hope Credit Union, trying to find the strengths in the small communities and find a way to turn that into economic development and growth. So in a place of such palpable need, we see all of our work as public, whether we're working for a public client or for private individuals, with effects outside of the lot lines of the project. We see each of our projects as instruments composed potentially to elevate human experience. There are really 2 types of instruments I like to think about: the instruments that codify and analyze the phenomena of our world, and instruments that provide the potential for transcendent or irreducible experiences. The first kind of instrument objectifies things, names them, measures distance, weight, water content, or identifies and classifies things like colors, directions, physical traits, or chemical properties. The second kind of instrument engages all of those actual things in our world, the physical properties and environmental phenomena, but then turns that into potential experiences of indescribable, moving, or even meaningful experience. And this second kind of instrument is, of course, the one we seek through our work. Even as all the tools we use to produce that work are instruments of the first kind. Lou Kahn said that we begin with the unmeasurable, go through measurable means, and try to end again with the unmeasurable. And as an amateur musician, I think about this a lot. Music, it doesn't need any reason for being other than emotional expression or potential sense of the transcendent. But the effort of building is so often overwhelmed by its practical and analytical concerns. And we're responsible to all of those. The question is, how can you do that and then get beyond that as well? Even a simple building is difficult. The simplest of buildings will require hours of tedium and labor and tens of hundreds of people. When we have been able to get a plaque on public buildings that show all the hands from the owner to the design team through the subcontractors and laborers, we'll sometimes have 350 people who laid hands on making a building happen. So it seems that seeking unmeasurable results to that work is essential to make all of that effort worthwhile. So I want to share a few examples of the struggle that you're all familiar with and working with, of using tools of measurement, analysis, and codification to try to make those potential experiences that could engage or inspire us. So to make buildings, we make drawings, we write letters, code reviews, field reports, budgets, and mock-ups, all of these very tedious things. I call these in our office our instruments of service, and along with the foundations that you read early when you come to work for us, you read about the instruments of service and how they embed the ethic of what we're trying to do in the work. Because as architects, we're rarely getting to construct. Some people do, but it's rare. So these instruments of service are those measurable means that we use to create actual architectural experience. So I want to share a couple of those with you. I'm going to show you some of those tools in relation to the work. A neighborhood is a complex organism of people, economies, conditions, and systems. To try to understand the Midtown neighborhood in Jackson, we needed many types of analytical tools, and you see a good bit of them here. To get at the maps on the right, we had community meetings, demographic research, surveys, building condition analyses. You really have to try to find all of those voices of the community and pull them all together, layer upon layer. But the larger goal was really to reverse decline in Midtown and to promote the healthy growth of the neighborhood. So after months of that sort of research you saw on the previous slide, it all came down into sort of 5 strategic initiatives. And every initiative had the goal of, now we knew where the strengths and liabilities of the neighborhood were. Every initiative had the goal to eliminate a liability and capitalize on a strength at the same time so that you could make the biggest impact with each move. The first of these is strategic initiatives is to increase housing density and diversity in the neighborhood. So families didn't have another type of housing they could move to if their family expanded or changed or contracted. 200 habitat houses had been built in the Midtown neighborhood. And you saw the footprint. It's a pretty small footprint. And that had a really stabilizing effect, But crime was still rising in Midtown and property values were still dropping. So we wanted to look at that standard infill house and analyze, what is it doing outside of itself? Now, one of those certainly is an economic question, and there was no ability for these properties to be sold except back to Habitat, so there was a whole economic side to that. But one of the things we looked at was the actual physical arrangement of public and private space, both in the house and as it affects the neighborhood. The standard infill Habitat house on your left has this consolidated red public space in the front of the building and then a consolidated private space in the back, all in a sort of slab-on-grade house. And it turns out to be about 36% public space. Our research in the neighborhood told us we have a lot of non-traditional families, a mother, a grandmother, 2 teenagers, a toddler, a middle school age child, all living in the same house. This house can't accommodate all those functions and keep people out together, so they retreat back to the bedrooms of the house. And because that house is a slab-on-grade and pretty close to its neighbors and the street, often the blinds get closed in the bedrooms, so they're not just retreating from their family, they're retreating from the neighborhood as well. So we proposed a 2-story solution that would increase that public proportion of space to 57% and also reconfigure it in a way that better accommodated the different types of families that would live there. Some of the strategic initiatives included zoning changes, but we wanted to make an effect quickly. So this project pushed the zoning of the current sites, there were 3 sites in the neighborhood, as much as it could. So this is a duplex, literally by definition. It's really only connected by the mechanical umbilical cord in the middle, which actually works really well. These houses are owned by the Housing Authority, Jackson Housing Authority, and they can come and service the units without getting into the residence space. They can take care of those without disturbing them. So we split and shifted the duplex, and that does a lot of great things for us. It makes 2 shared yards, a front and a rear yard, that 3 houses always look over. And it also makes the floor plate of the building smaller and easier to construct and less expensive, and also lets light come in on multiple sides of the house. So the number of committed residents more than doubles on these 3 scattered sites. We also had a 6-plex as well. But the scale and repetition of the porches still feel like they are part of the neighborhood. They yield a sense of comfort and fit. And the healthy growth of the neighborhood, that sort of thing that how do you know if you're doing that or not? You really know if you come and spend time in between these houses and talk to the residents about why they love to live there. They watch each other's children. They know their neighbors. They can interact. They don't have to interact. They say that it gives them just the right amount of connection to their neighbors. And the actually standard infill house is across the street. You can see the difference there. You could come out on that porch. It only faces south, which is a problem in our climate, as you know, here in Atlanta. So those non-traditional families, this is the first floor, they're more easily accommodated. You can picture 2 or 3 teenagers hanging out in the front, mom and grandmother cooking dinner in the back with the middle-aged child doing homework at the bar in the kitchen. So and all the light coming from the multiple orientations. And you go upstairs to the private bedrooms, and because they're on that second floor, they're less likely, and we watch this, they're less likely to close the blinds and more likely to look out over their neighborhood and keep it safe. One of the sites in particular was on a park. This park had no real renovations done to it. The difference was there were people, committed residents, looking over it. This park was dangerous and sort of abandoned except for teenagers up to some no good. And now it really is, with very little change to the park itself, contributing to the character of the neighborhood. The next project tackled a couple more of those strategic initiatives. Number 3 was to make a mixed-use neighborhood. Number 2 was to expand capacity building and health services. And again, all of these initiatives, remember, were to take away a liability and capitalize on an asset at the same time. The asset for this site is that this is Fortification Street, which is a main street in and out of Jackson. And this is Lamar, which you see is a good thoroughfare through the neighborhood that's traveled a lot. So this is a major entry point into the neighborhood. That was its asset. Obvious liability. It was a rundown liquor store, an abandoned grocery store, not contributing good things to the neighborhood. So the tool that was most important here were there were several south-facing wall sections all along that side of the building. This was about using that wall section to keep as many of the existing materials as we possibly could, because we couldn't afford more than that, to find a way to inexpensively shade the south side of the building and make space in front of it, and to lift up this sort of low-slung building that felt like it was slipping down the hill. And the proposal was, can we make this commercial drive-up building feel a little bit more civic? So the best civic buildings establish a scale that has community stature, but also invite individuals to inhabit their spaces. And this simple steel-framed, metal-clad canopy helps us do that, to raise the scale up and the stature of the building, and to create that threshold to inhabit between the parking and the building entries. So a place where loitering was a bad thing in front of these buildings before, now gathering is encouraged because the building has been changed in its use. There's a community room, housing authority offices, because they now had so many units in the neighborhood, they needed offices to serve their residents. And remarkably, a health clinic. How many of us live in a neighborhood where we can walk down to a walk-in health clinic in our neighborhood? And we think the building stands a little more proudly on the low slope of Fortification Street. And this is a good thing because Fortification, like a lot of streets, main streets coming into Jackson, have suffered a lot of vacancies and derelict structures. So any time we can hold that edge is a good thing. And over the years, we've worked with a local metal shop to figure out what their capabilities are so we can find really inexpensive ways to do custom things that feel sort of hand-built and scale the buildings down to the people who are using them. So these are drawings for bent plate aluminum shrouds for the windows and benches and signage. And I can never show this building without explaining the importance of Spur's barbershop to the neighborhood. During the planning process, we continually heard about him in resident surveys, in community conversations and interviews. He's like a one-man cultural institution in the neighborhood, and everybody agreed he had to stay. So he may only have this one small space on the end of the building, but everybody considers him the anchor tenant. And because it was back to that asset of location, it was a great place to establish a neighborhood sign and neighborhood identity. So all of those tools that I talked about, the tools of the master plan, the analysis of the standard infill house, the wall sections and details along the south side of the commercial building, those again are those measurable means that we use to propose a meaningful change. So we asked, can you, with minimal and strategic interventions, promote the healthy growth of a neighborhood and immediately affect property values? And that is true. Since the planning effort, more than $20 million have been spent in the neighborhood, and the property values are rising. And actually, private developers are risking their money in the neighborhood now, and that's when you know that you've turned that economy around. Can you take a rundown commercial building and make it something generous and a little more civic? And while you're doing that, can each individual person feel welcomed by the building, even while they feel like they're part of a larger community that has real character and identity? So the next few projects, we're going to move to the Delta, the Mississippi Delta. And as I showed you earlier, poverty and inequity, they're sort of evident everywhere you look in the Delta. This is a project for the Mississippi Center for Justice. in their Indianola office. And they are a pro bono law services organization. They provide individual services to people, but they also try to find ways that they can battle sort of systemic inequities. They started in Jackson, but after Katrina, they opened an office on the coast to help the people who had been infected in multiple ways, economically and housing-wise on the coast. And then they opened their office here in the Delta to deal with educational inequities, because education is so essential in a place with so little to offer all of its people. They had an ideal location here next to the Sunflower County Courthouse, but it was really a simple commercial building, and we needed to try to find a way to communicate the social and cultural mission of the Mississippi Center for Justice. We couldn't afford, the only thing we really did on the exterior was the sign, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. So we had to really do all of this on the inside of the building to try to make connections, to embed a story into the interior of the building. So to do that, I'll talk to you a little bit first about the place and about the founder of the Mississippi Center for Justice. Martha Bergmark founded the center, and her father was a professor at Millsaps College, which is in Jackson. And Millsaps College in the 60s partnered with Tougaloo College during the Civil Rights Movement, and we'll have more about that later. But for Martha, as a child, when her father was doing that teaching in the Civil Rights Movement, this was really formative for her. So the picture of the tiles on the left, the roofing tiles, these were a building that Millsaps had demolished, and we found out these roofing tiles were available, and they'll do anything for Martha. We could have them and use them. We didn't know how we were going to do that yet, but they had a distinct character, and they had some meaning for Martha and for her staff, so we knew we were going to find a way to use them. And coincidentally, they had this color that had everything to do with the cypress breaks in the Delta, one of which, when you saw on the map, comes right in to the middle of Indianola, just a block away from this office. And I don't know if you can see Kermit there. He's not actually from Indianola. He's from Leland, Mississippi, but that's only 16 miles away. And he's one of my favorite Mississippians, of course. So we tried to utilize these tiles to help us, like I said, make that sort of elusive figure in the middle of the building. Privacy is really important for the people who come in and ask for help here, privacy with their attorney, so we had to have a lot of enclosed offices. But we wanted to try to find a way to embody hope and expectation in the shared spaces. So we utilized these roofing tiles to make a curved wall that lines the sort of hallway and sort of brings you in, makes you sort of want to walk around it. And then when you get to the inside of it, you're in the conference room in the center of the building. And I want to take a minute to talk about this sort of labor of love that was construction administration on this project. Shannon Gathings was the project architect. And this is one of her field reports, one of her better field reports here. The contractor was a friend of the nonprofit, and this always sounds like a good idea, but not always such a good idea. And he was working outside of his area, so he was really surprised and continued to relearn this lesson. There's not a lot of skilled labor in the Delta, and he really didn't know how to sort of deal with that impediment. But as you can see in Shannon's field reports, she really became the educational and craft leader of the project, patiently explaining how to make things work and how to deal with the surprises they came across during the construction. And no matter how long and arduous the site visit was, she always came back and wrote these very instructive and informative field reports for the contractor and for all of his subs. And the consequence was she increased the abilities of the labor she was working with. She protected the contractor, sometimes from himself, and she protected the funds of the Mississippi Center for Justice. So I like to think of Shannon's efforts as a sort of model of the Mississippi Center for Justice mission. Go into a difficult situation with very little money, but with unwavering commitment, expect and do something exceptional. So the people who come here and ask for help, they don't have to know the story of the tiles or understand the struggle of the construction process, I think, to know that this is a place they will find some help. And though we could only afford the signs that you saw in an earlier image as well, we tried to turn those signs into devices for presence and engagement. Every time you visit, depending on the time and the season, the building is a little bit different than it was before. And you may be, for a moment, made more aware of the light and the shadows and the materials around you than you were before. So just down the road from Indianola is Itta Bena, and it's the home of the historically black university, Mississippi Valley State University. And the James H. White Library sits in the sort of dead center of campus, and I use that term intentionally, the dead center. You'll see in a minute how flat the landscape can be. Again, a limited budget, and we had to keep as much of the building as we possibly could, but still find a way to transform it. So that's the existing building, and it's that flat and that large of an expanse on all sides. It's biaxially symmetrical, and these horizontal lines are sort of relentless, with very few, as you see, windows that are large enough to actually get any views into or out of the building. So we used a sort of effort of, we couldn't get into the roof. You'll see it's a waffle slab where every member is doing exactly what it needs to do, very hard to cut into. But we could sort of take these swaths to make two-story bays on multiple faces of the building to try to break down that symmetry and to break into those horizontal lines. And one of the things we had to figure out, like these fins, particularly the ones right under the roof, like what are those for? And we had to figure out what are we going to do? Are we going to remove those? We decided to make friends with them. We decided to proliferate them even more and make bigger versions of them and taller versions of them and try to find a way to use them to make more space around the edges of the building. And they're really good for keeping too much direct light from coming too deeply into the building, so they work really well. Again, back to the tools for this, the wall section was utterly important. When we decided we wanted this two-story stroke, every time the structural engineer came back with solutions, the existing structure wouldn't take it. So we had to figure out how are we going to make this big move without spending too much money reinforcing the existing structure. So we finally just let ourselves build a small little foundation at each bay that can hold the dead load for the curtain wall and the new fins. And then the structure had just enough capacity to take the wind load of those systems in front. This is a compressed version of one of those bays where we're using the fins, and then the center fin is the exact dimension of the other fins, the original fins in the building. And then we utilized another version at the edges to let us get insulation and actual performance in the enclosure. And then as part of buying into what those things could do, we extended the material, a different material, but we extended the fins deep into the space, and again, bouncing that natural light in as far as we could and making real spaces on the edges of the building. So I think the effect is that you make that connection out to campus, and the campus is connected back into the building as well. So this tool, you may say, why am I showing you this one? But these are the colored collections, types of collections of books in the library's collection. And it seems like, so much tedium. We are telling where they'll all fit and how growth can happen. But the librarian here had never really gone through a weeding process like this. And you have to remember when we first walked in there, I mean, it was just wall-to-wall stacks. She could not really believe how much smaller of a stack footprint we were going to be able to achieve without this drawing. And that was important so that we could achieve these spaces, a computer lab, conference room, student study, individual study. We were able to get these really student-centered spaces by using this tool to help her understand that. And again, I said we couldn't touch that waffle slab, so it's a pretty deep floor plate. And I think, you know, we might still be stretching. We got this as close as we could. It might feel a little longer than it actually is. So we dropped these sort of warm oak-clad kiosks in the middle. They're the computer kiosks and the information desks on each floor. So now I think that wide, flat delta horizon that we started with on the campus really becomes a part of the interior because it's coming through openings that have a scale that can possibly compete with the scale of the landscape on campus. The expansive sky, the thunderstorms approaching from the west, they aren't just something you see when you're in this space, they change the space. They become alive in your experience. So once a closed and imposing building on site, I think it's now an actual and a visual invitation to the students and the teachers, and the use is way up. If I'd shown you inside pictures, you would understand that. It's obvious. So the next project is still along the Mississippi River, but further south. We're not in the Delta anymore. We're south of Vicksburg at Alcorn State University. This is another historically black college and university. It's actually Medgar Evers' alma mater, and a couple of years back, they had Merle Evers Williams back in a faculty position. But like Mississippi Valley State University, Alcorn has precious little funds for building and precious even fewer funds for maintenance. So you have to learn to build durably and sort of strategically there. We were commissioned to replace this building, which is Dumas Hall and sits along the historic center of the campus. And everyone was expecting and excited about a brand new building. But when they shared the budget with us, we were like, it's never, we can never replace this many square feet in a new building for you. The budget had, the funding had waited and slowly became much less than it needed to be. So we recommended that we do a feasibility study to figure out if there was any portion or portions of the buildings that we could maintain or rehabilitate. And it seemed impossible. This was the condition in the basement and underneath the building. There were at least 3 sort of rivers that ran when there was enough rain through the building. And there was a large crack that was evident on one portion of the building. So everybody thought, no way we're going to be able to keep any of this. But surprisingly, we could deal with that one crack, and we could keep the entire foundation and concrete structure. And that was better than $1 million worth of value. So we were able to nearly get a new building by rehabilitating this existing one. So I show you this foundation plan because I have never, and have before or since, had to do a survey of a foundation in order to figure out what the contours were. And when we were done, it looked like areas of field and stream under the building. And when you're doing a lot of public bid work, which we have done over the years, everybody talks about change orders and how you've got to avoid change orders. And, reasonable thing to try to avoid. We do too. But we really prefer to think about why we do our documents as a way to promote a fair bid process and a creative and productive construction process. So this is a drawing that I pull out for my new employees a lot to try to explain the difference in those two sort of perspectives. We could have used these photographs and some very stern notes, and we could have held the contractor accountable for filling in all of that, and we could have avoided the dreaded change order, but probably not without a fight, and probably not without some consequences, negative consequences to our relationship with the contractor. So we made calculating that cubic feet of fill easy. And that's important because the contractors who were bidding the work knew they had to estimate it closely, but we were serious about showing them exactly what they needed to do, and it promoted that fair bid process. It set an ethic for clarity, but most importantly, it preserved us from having that fight that we didn't have to have, because design work doesn't stop during the construction process, and if you can maintain a good and productive relationship with your contractor, you're able to continue to make design refinements as you're building the building. So we were able to, once we got that drainage issue solved and knew we actually had a salvageable structure, we were able to totally reskin the building and make a couple of real transformative moves as well. As you remember from the original photograph, the building, it was literally in a hole, as the rivers beneath showed, but it also figuratively felt like it was in a hole on the campus. So we needed to make a way for it to lift itself up and give it some presence on the campus center. So most of that enclosure, that reskinning that we did, the original skin had nearly no insulation and didn't even come close to meeting the wind load requirements, so we had to lose it all. And so we came back with a really low-tech but high-performance brick rain screen wall. And that's a sort of a whole story in itself of how we got that done and done well in this rural place in Mississippi. But then we got that done everywhere. Once we got that ethic and that ability going, that covered most of the building. And we could focus on two really strategic moves, one of which is this cantilevered conference room that you see in this wall section. The line with the parapet in the middle is the line of existing structure, and we feathered a steel structure in and braced it with the concrete frame so that we were able to make a pretty incredible cantilever in the front of the building. It also made a really modern version of a porch along the front facade. So again, selective and strategic demolition. We were doing things here like using a multitude of members and smaller members, everything we could do to make it lighter and more transparent. We used composite pieces. We put two pieces together so we could keep them thin from the front, and we even used a Varandale truss that you see running across the back there. This is a cross-section in the other direction, and again, you see those repetitive steel members. We added a sort of bent plate on the bottom and then incorporated lighting, another way to lighten up this cantilevered box that we were making. So effectively, this conference room is, it's got a really great prospect on the campus green. You can see to the right the historic buildings that you're seeing views of there. It's become the de facto president's conference room, even though his building is on the other side of campus. This is where he comes to hold some of his important meetings. And then that other strategic move was to cut one significant hole in the middle between the two wings of the building and bring natural light in and add this communicating stair in the middle that's larger and it's got more space than you need, so it promotes some of those educational interactions that take place outside the classroom. So you can see down a line of sort of historic dormitory buildings that are a line of porches and repetitive windows. This building really carries that line forward and then comes to the end where it's getting closer to the historic administration building and makes that sort of lifted presence on the campus green. I think the building achieves a sort of campus fit through material and proportion and pattern, but it also is of its time, and it's a challenging the stylistic expectations of many people who work on the campus, but not the people who run the campus itself. They really don't want a replication of historic styles here. They would rather have a progressive expression of architecture to mimic their progressive ideas on campus. So now I'm going to take you back to Jackson. On the north side of Jackson is the Tougaloo community and Tougaloo College. And in 1862, John Bodie had a slave plantation here, and by all accounts, he was a particularly cruel slave owner and apparently not such a good businessman. His wife, young wife, left him very early in their relationship, and eventually the plantation failed and had to be sold. It was bought by the American Missionary Association, who turned the campus into a school to serve the underserved and even former slaves as well. And that foundation really comes forward at Tougaloo College. Remember Martha Bergmark in the earlier story and Millsaps College. Martha's father was amazed by these images here, what was happening at Tougaloo College. He was inspired by those. The upper right-hand corner here is Ernst Berinsky, who was a German Jewish immigrant who came to teach at Tougaloo College. And he started what he called these social science seminars, and he was bringing all of the thinkers from across the nation and exposing them to the students. You'll recognize a very young Andrew Young here on the left speaking at the chapel at Tougaloo. And these seminars were really doing nothing less than teaching the Tougaloo students to become civil rights heroes. And that foundation comes forward to this day. The college really seeks, even though it's a very small number of students, to create servant leaders, people who make a difference in their community. And this is one of many marches led out of Tougaloo's gates with students in the middle. This is one in particular led by Martin Luther King Jr. So with such a commitment to progressive action, you might expect Tougaloo to want to erase its plantation history. But remarkably, Tougaloo lives its motto, which is where history meets the future. The plantation mansion remains and actually has been lovingly and carefully restored. And the agrarian campus center, with its sort of dotted by live oaks and hung full of Spanish moss, is respected and maintained. But the new buildings here are expected to be progressive. They by no means have a desire for any replication. So this is the mansion, the small building number 1. This is Holmes Hall, which was our sister building. It's an industrial arts classroom building. And the bricks on Holmes Hall were actually handmade on site on Tougaloo's campus. So you'll see the brick in the building we build, which is the Benny G. Thompson Civil Rights and Academic Research Center, which was replacing Beard Hall, which is where Ernst Berinsky had many of his social science seminars. So not surprisingly, the mansion claims the highest point on the land, claims its authority there, and then it reinforces its authority with a raised plinth, and a symmetrical form, and a very grand central entry. But on the left is our new building, and again, the place where Beard Hall once stood. And at Beard Hall, the individual student's authority clearly mattered more than the institutions and systems they found themselves living in. So we felt like our building had to, if it did nothing else, it had to in every way and in form empower the authority of the individual students. So unlike the mansion, our building mass is offset and more engaged in the landscape. The entry is suppressed and indirect and set back, and you experience it over time. And this porch is not one where you feel like you're exposed and you shouldn't stand there very long, as you're going to see the president now instead of the master. This is a porch that encourages you to linger. And the shape of the building in plan and in section, as you'll see in a minute, really does everything it can to promote visual access in and between spaces and to make the boundaries of each space indeterminate. So the building invites students to claim its spaces, to climb on it, to make the space their own. And though I'm talking to you today in descriptive prose, I've always thought that poetry is a better way to try to grasp the experience of architecture. Sound resonates in the chamber, and I feel it in my bones. Students, teachers speak in an exchange. They are together, they are alone. These bones bear witness with the worn wisdom stored in stone, with the cool comfort found in ground. The stability of the horizon stills the soul. The glow that is beyond it, that is also draped upon it, beckons us on. For now, for then, for later, and what it means, we'll be next. I wait here among these bones, these companions, or parts of bigger things, like you, like me, or like none of us at all. So am I, so are you, let's march together. One day we may know. But what we know now is that it matters. The energy is not contained. It's transferred in the exchange. To you, to me, to this space, and to these bones. For now, for then, for later, and what it means, we'll be next. So every space tries to provide this invitation to linger, but also offers an inner horizon, a thing that beckons you to go further and experience more spaces in and around the building. And in all of these, the courtyard grounds and expands that experience at once. So the surface in the shape and detail of the building, what we tried to do was make spaces and surfaces slip past one another to make their dimensions and extents a little bit harder to discern. And the idea comes through every detail. This red line that I've added to the photographs just tracks one vertical stroke as it occurs in multiple areas through the building. And these are the drawings and the sketches that track that line and try to do a thing that's kind of hard to do and requires a lot of different details. Separate the structure from the enclosure, engage them back together, separate enclosure from the space around you, make the transition from one facade to another, not happen in one moment, but happen over time. So all of these strategies, again, are trying to promote something that you have a hard time describing. We're always working for those conditions that are hard to figure out. And language and content, they can certainly short circuit such an effort. So when the president asked us to incorporate these extremely powerful civil rights images into the building, we knew we had our work cut out for us. We knew we had to find a way to sort of balance, give that verbal language content some competition in the architectural experience of the space. So we located all of this imagery in these sort of compressed vestibules between all the wings of the building and on multiple floors. We made, hopefully, that content really palpable, larger than life, imposing and pressing in on you like the struggles themselves. So on the day of the grand opening, we were actually really surprised. We had these big open public spaces. This is the new gallery that houses Tougaloo's art collection that had, before this building was built, was stored like in a storage unit off. They have a really great collection of modern art as well as African art. And this space, multi-purpose lecture hall and performance space and several other large open spaces. But we found these freedom riders and civil rights leaders all crowded into the vestibule throughout the event, finding themselves and the people they know who were part of the moments depicted in the photographs. I'm doing okay. So the last project is the Oakridge House. And disclaimer, it's our house. So we could, if we were going to make a bold experiment, here was our chance. We were the only ones who were going to suffer it. And I have to say, our children have accused us of a certain amount of social engineering on them. Now they complain about the size of their bedrooms in relation to the other spaces in the house, which you'll see. But what we proposed is that home is not just a place of comfort and respite, but also a place where you locate yourself in the larger world, where you experience some challenge. Melanie Klein considered our experiences as an infant moving from the envelopment of our mother's arms to the exposure of the greater world. We need comfort for our stability, but we need risk and exposure to develop a sense of ourselves. And as we all know, that is a scary moment, but it's also the doorway to real creative freedom. And you might say we all spend our time through life moving between these poles of experience, risking for growth and innovation, seeking comfort to sort of recharge our souls and give us a foundation to ground our future adventures. So in this house, the living and dining room is really more like a courtyard than it is like an interior room. And just to orient you, this is north-south, so the sun rises in the east over the trees and sets in the west over Oakridge Drive, which is here. And then the bedroom wing, as you see, with the very small bedrooms for our children, which we hear a lot about, goes along east and west. And gives us, this is really a model from our, we formerly lived in a bungalow house, and one of the best things about the bedroom was that it always looked to the north, towards the north, which meant what it was looking at always had beautiful sunlight and shadow on it. So this was really a model of the bungalow house that we had lived in previously. We brought that forward in the master bedroom. So the street is really like its namesake, Oakridge Drive. There is a ridge that runs behind all of the houses, as you see here. And it's really a beautiful backdrop to most of them. So the challenge and the risk and the comfort together really starts at the entry. The scale is huge here. It's too big in a way, but it reaches out for you, reaches its arms out to welcome you in. And then when you get to the door, it's a solid metal-clad door, not a door with glass in it. And again, I said it's more like a courtyard than an interior space, so it's formed by the facades on the south and the north side. So the bedroom wing comes in, and it's clad in slate shingles and comes right into the building and forms the south side of the room. And then a smaller pecan facade forms the north side of the room. A stairway and bookcases wrap behind that up to the loft, and then the studio is down below it. As you can see here on the right, the east side is very open. We don't even have blinds or curtains on that window. The sun rises and washes sunlight onto that pecan wall. And then on the west side to the street side. And you can, if both of those are open, you feel exposed, but it's actually, it can be a really good feeling. Every Saturday morning we open up the west side so we can experience that. But every space also offers you a choice to inhabit the enclosed edges, like this space that you see here, the stairs down to the studio. So you can either choose to inhabit that edge or to move to the exposed center. In a way, making that choice between envelopment and exposure sort of daily through the house. Even the bedrooms and the master bath, which is the last window here, have these really large windows onto the world, so to speak. But again, blinds and drapes give you the ability to sort of transform that space back to your own personal space. So the power to choose how we inhabit space is something to be celebrated. For us, form is not the thing, but the experience between us and things, between us and our environment. And in space, in time, and by our choice, we form the experience of architecture as much as it informs us. So in this ongoing experiment, we believe that architecture can act as an instrument to engage the changing phenomena of our environment, its light, color, brightness, history, people, stories, materials, and like a musical instrument can form the potential space for irreducible, indescribable, moving experiences that may have that ability to make our heart skip a beat and make us feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Thanks. I'll be glad to answer any questions anyone has.
For buildings that you're trying to repurpose, or when you show up and a client has this decision to take down a building, what are the tools that you use to really craft your argument, especially from an economic side, on why to keep a building, especially the building you show us?
Yeah. It's a pretty easy argument to make in Mississippi because we almost always have too little money to do what we need to do. So when we can turn it into a money argument, as well as show them some examples of how much they won't feel like it's the same building they had before, those are really the two most powerful ways we can do it.
This was a phenomenal talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I came in with completely different questions. No, because of your other, the maintenance thing that you guys did was also unique. But I'm really, really interested in, and I'm still trying to make sense of it, the way in which you talk about your work is also part and parcel of how you make it, clearly, because this is not a discourse that sits outside for public consumption. And just a couple of things. I'll ask the simplest thing. I was trying to take a note of what were the instruments in each of the 7 projects that you showed, the tools that you call them the tools, right?
Uh-huh.
So, for instance, in the Justice Center, would you say it was the field reports?
Yes. Yeah.
In the library, it was that incredible archaeology of the foundation plan.
Yeah.
In Tuvalu, were there vignettes of the episodes?
Yeah, and for Tuvalu, I can't tell you how many tools it was for, and there are multiple tools. These are just the ones that I really selected.
Because there's great photographs in your accounting later, and I was wondering whether it was pretty early on that you knew that you had to include these amazing archival photographs.
We knew pretty early on. So if you remember the sketch where we're showing the visual access across the building, we knew early on that we were going to have those vestibules. And we didn't know exactly how we were going to bring them in, but that was early expectation of where we would incorporate them.
So, I mean, as a strategy, it is so powerful because it allows something else to come in, but also gives you this sort of Trojan horse that you're going to work through all the way.
Yeah.
And so, in your own house, what are the instruments? What are the tools?
Oh, I actually was going to show you one of it's the plumber's restroom problem in your own house. Most of the tools that I would have shown you are like a sketch that we then scanned and put on a sheet and sent back to. We would go home. Roy would go on his way to school. I would go on my way home. And we'd find out what the next detail was that was needed in there. But that we didn't have that axon early. That is generated after the fact to sort of explain the exploded axon. But we have been talking about Melanie Klein and the idea of envelopment and exposure for years, and I could talk about that idea in multiple projects, but in that one we got to sort of do it purely. So the tool would have been those readings and that ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I was trying to think of other architects who work this way, and the only other one, again, they're a partnership, and they've been married for many, many years, is Anne Lagaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal of Lagaton Vassal. And they work also with the answer to that gentleman says, they will never demolish. They prefer to add and subtract. And there's this beautiful quote of theirs that I was thinking of as you were talking about your work. We prefer the term to inhabit rather than to rehabilitate. Since in the act of rehabilitation or restoration, the core is still inhabitation. And that's fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And for me, that when I said I'm constantly, I'll get in a space that's made my heart skip the beat and go, how is this working? What is this space doing to make that work? And one of those things is, and this may be a little bit off subject, but those pieces and parts of the building that are either clearly have already lasted through many other people coming and going from it, or who clearly would be able to. And that's really a little bit what that poem was about, is the sense that as soon as you've made a structure of that sort of level of durability, it will bear witness over time, as the ones that we've used previously do. And when you take and cut into them, and you're cutting into a thing that has had other people inhabit it over time. And those stories matter, to people.
So, really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Music and poetry seem to be at the heart of the soul of the organization. When you're interviewing students or future employees, do you look for characteristics about poetry and music?
Really don't. And it's only recently that I've talked about it, really talked directly about it in the last few years. It's been sort of something in the background. But to answer your question, one thing we do, I have a set, talk about tools. I ask potential employees the same questions every time, with a few, plus or minus added in there. I tell Roy, you can come in to ask whatever you want so that I can kind of use those questions. Over years of asking the same questions, you start to realize what they show you about the person that you're interviewing. And very few of them are, I can say about some of my staff, she answered the door question like no one else, like you kind of remember that. But if there's one thing that we do, it's what I said at the beginning. If we have a sense that a potential employee is all about sort of expressing their sort of self, their identity, we're like, that's really great, but it's not really going to work here for us and for everybody we interview. It needs to really be about those consequences of the work in other people's lives, because we that's what we spend so much time talking about and doing.
So was the poem written during the construction of the building, or was it written afterwards?
After. I had a chance to go spend, we were doing some photography and I was spending time in the building, and I just had a chance to sit and spend some time, and that's when it was written. And to speak, I'm an amateur poet and an amateur musician. I think I'm a professional architect, but I'm an amateur at those other two.
Is Mississippi a good place for architects? How is the health of the profession in Mississippi?
It is a limited group. I mean, we have a small number of architects in Mississippi, and so the culture of it is hard to maintain, and it ebbs and flows with such a small number. But what you can do, the impact you can have is really big. You can leverage like we do, those strengths and weaknesses that we do in a community. You really can have an effect that you can watch happen in front of you. The city is small enough that we can say we have helped change it. And the state now, the things that we're doing in the Delta, we can say we've had not just a pretty thing that we've made, but we've had some real impact. So yeah, we think it's when I said that early on, I had no idea I was going to just be a Mississippian for the rest of my life, but here I am. I was a Tennessean, now I'm a Mississippian. I like all those double consonants and vowels, I guess.
When you're at the table designing with all of your fellow designers, and you're having these conversations about, we want to create spaces that allow, people to skip a heartbeat or to improve their experience. How do you decide, what are those conversations like? How do you decide what goes? What will be the most impactful? Is it based on research, or is it, do you go with your gut? I would like to know how that happens.
Really, no one project in our office is the work by itself. We're practicing in a constantly depressed economy, so we take our innovation one step at a time, and we try materials over and over again. The brick on the Tougaloo building was the third time we had used that particular brick, but because of Holmes Hall on the other side, we fired it a little longer, and we got more black and purple bricks in the mix. So we tend to sort of use materials over and over again and change them for each project. And so that is research in and of itself. We kind of always go back to the previous project and ask ourselves, what does it need to be different? How does it need to be done differently here? That idea of using actual materials that have a sense of time in them is something we try to do as much as possible. Things like exposing structure against other surfaces, things that we do over and over again. And the thing I said about language short-circuiting that possible experience, that is one of the things we talk about a lot, because that can happen not just with language, but with a stylistic move, bless you, that it makes you read the building instead of experience it. So that, is this a moment where you're making the building readable, is a conversation we have a lot as well. And I think those foundations bring people into the conversation over time a lot as well.
What are some strategies that you guys also have here for engaging the community? For instance, with the students at Tougaloo, how did you guys bring floor plans, sections, photos? Just how you guys work to also engage the community and also kind of teach the students how to
It's a lot. A lot of people do this. We bring in, the first thing is we bring in the research, the sort of the foundation of where you're starting. When we're talking about communities, those maps that I showed you of Midtown, people all of a sudden see the facts of their community in a different way when you present it graphically back to them, and you've taken all of those numbers and bring it back. So that's the foundation, is that research and showing that. And in a building, it's the same thing. We really brought out those stories of the history of what had happened at Beard Hall by working with the president and the vice president. And so we brought that story forward as part of the initial design process. And in our planning work, and also in the design work, we just get people talking. So in the planning work, we do surveys, online surveys, paper surveys, door-to-door surveys. We try to find whoever, however they want to talk to us, we try to find a way to get them to talk to us. And we tend, one of the things we don't do, which is we don't do charrettes. We put that information in front of the people and ask them to tell us more, the things we haven't seen yet. So show us on this map what is a problem that we haven't shown you yet, and show us what's an opportunity that we haven't identified yet as well. So I hope that answers that. Great.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.